Great. Thank you all for coming. This is an overview of the cluster API provider, infrastructure provider using Docker as the infrastructure. I wanted to give an overview of this project as I've been working on it for a little while, but we're getting to a point now with the transition in cluster API from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2, where there is an awful lot of work to do, and it would be great to get this project to have more contributors and more reviewers. And it's just a general nice way to get people introduced into cluster API because it sort of shows you what infrastructure providers need to do without actually needing an infrastructure provider on a cloud. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share my my development environment right now, or maybe just my Goland if I can find it. Yeah, this one. And real quick, I'm going to check out the master branch because I haven't done that yet. Okay. Great. So I'm just going to start by doing a quick code overview of the layout and why this might look a little bit different than other projects you've seen, and the reasons behind that, the releases that we're doing, the work that needs to be done to go from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2, and then we're going to go through a little bit of backlog grooming. And if your question on chat is important, I cannot see it easily, so just feel free to yell it out. Okay, I figured I'd get the chat window up. Yes, works on OS X sometimes. It does actually work on OS X all the time, but it depends on what you're trying to do, really. And we can get to that. Let me write down that note. So we'll cover OS X 10 edge cases later on. Okay, code overview. So you might notice this project looks a little bit different than most of the projects that you've seen in Kubernetes. There's a complete lack of the PKG directory. And so this came from controller runtime and the KubeBuilder project. They moved away from the package directory just to kind of keep, that seems to be a Go best practice anyway that I've seen, but sort of a copy and paste difference here because now this is actually most of this code is generated from a KubeBuilder installation, which means you'll have all the usual culprits like an API directory, you'll have a controllers directory, and you'll get, I moved this into here, or into the manager, but you'll have the manager that actually runs the controller, along with some other commands that this provider supports. And you can see there's old legacy code here too. So actuators in cluster API V1 Alpha 1 actuators have gone away, but this is still here in the master branch, and that will get into what needs to happen going from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2. And so the main entry point here is really capd control. So if you're familiar with cluster API, there's a project, there's a program that is shipped with every provider called cluster control, and that gives you a way to create clusters from the command line somewhat easily. So this aims to do pretty much the exact same thing. This is not a useful view. I should show you the actual command line tool. But basically, let me show my terminal as well. Yeah, we'll do this. Make that massive. Okay. So the program capd control. You can see there's a bunch of subcommands here. So you've got setup. So you're going to create a management cluster. And then that's broken up into two steps. There's the kind. So you create the actual kind cluster, which is how this runs a management cluster. There's platform control, which installs the cluster API platform, which is the various providers needed to run cluster API. And then it also has a bunch of helper functions here. So you can print out a bunch of YAML. So if I were to say, if I want to install a cluster, I can do capd control and say cluster, and then it'll, let me put that to JQ so you can actually read that. And then you can actually see that, oh, cool, I've got some V1 Alpha 2 YAML that I can install on the cluster. So it's just really a helper tool for getting started so that you don't have to copy and paste so many things. Okay. And then manager, obviously, or not obviously, is the thing that runs on the cluster that keeps track of the CRDs that this provider creates, which is found in the API directory. Oh, I'm not showing that anymore. Okay, there it goes. In the API directory that is generated by KubeBuilder. So it's got this thing called Docker machine, and the Docker machine has a spec and a status. These are two completely empty structs because we have not found any information that we actually need to put in there yet, but I'm hoping that we will figure that out as we move forward. And then the interesting code here is in the controllers. So if you're familiar with KubeBuilder, this looks very familiar to you. There's just one reconcile function that will, when the manager starts, it adds a watch to the CRD, the Docker machine CRD, and then this is the function that responds to any changes to a Docker machine type that it sees. In addition to that, Cluster API also requires that we reconcile Docker machines, infrastructure provider machines, when we see a Cluster API machine change, and this is due to the references between the objects. So this function down here will watch, will basically add a watch that says, if I see a Cluster API machine change, then I should look at whatever associated Docker machine there is with that machine, and I should re-reconcile that Docker machine. And as you can see, this is not fleshed out. The reconcile function should be much larger. It doesn't actually do anything. All it does is look up the Docker machine from etcd or the API server, and then it just logs an informational log, that's all it does. It doesn't actually create anything yet. So this is currently in a non-working state.
Hey, Chuck.
Yep.
So that machine to Docker machine function, we actually have what I believe is a generic function that does the same thing in Cluster API called machine to infrastructure map func. So take a look at that when you get a chance. I think that you can probably get rid of this function and replace it with the common one.
Great.
And then the other thing I wanted to mention was if you all aren't familiar with some of the changes coming in the newer version of controller runtime, one thing that you don't see in this, actually, nope, never mind. I see it there. Ignore me.
What was it? Just out of curiosity.
I was going to say that the watch is not set up exactly the same way that it was done in the older version of controller runtime. But because depending on if you go off of like the KubeBuilder v2 scaffolding or not, you may find that the watch setup that you have highlighted right there is done in the manager file instead of in the controller file.
Yes.
So never mind.
No worries. Thank you for the background.
This is a V2 project, right?
This is a V2 project, but we also have to support V1 Alpha 1 as well. And so we have a release branch in Docker in this called release-0.1, and that is going to be actively developed alongside this version as well, and that's going to be tracking V1 Alpha 1 for Cluster API.
Sorry, just are you using KubeBuilder v2?
Oh, KubeBuilder v2. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. We're using KubeBuilder. Yeah, this is from KubeBuilder v2, which is still, there's still some things to come along. It's still in beta, so we're hoping that it doesn't change too much from the release. But. Okay, let's see. What else is interesting here? Nothing else is really interesting here. So that's pretty much the code overview. There needs to be some work done to flesh this out to make it actually useful. And that's sort of the V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2. So if you look at the actuators directory here, this will look familiar to the V1 Alpha 1 folks. There's a machine actuator and a cluster actuator, and I expect that this logic could, at least for now, just port over almost directly to the Docker machine controller. I just haven't gotten around to doing it yet. This is all kept here just sort of as a reference point for what it was doing, and I expect it will go away in short order. But we do have an issue open. I'm gonna switch screens now to the issue tracker for this project. There's Safari. There is Safari. Yeah. So I have an issue open, number 127, support v1 alpha 2. I'm trying to keep this relatively up to date, and I tagged the wrong Fabrizio in here. So there are a couple of things that are left to do. So it's update CAPT control to support v1 alpha 2 infrastructure. So that there's actually a pull request for that right now that's open that will close this issue. So we're getting there. And there's another bullet point here that's not added, but we actually have to implement the controller logic, which seems fairly central to all of this. But those are the only two things that are left. And I say only that implementing the controller logic is not trivial. But I think we can go through what is left to do on the backlog and what I would like to do moving forward with this. There are a couple of things that might be good starting points for people to get involved in, but we can get to those in a second. So I'm just going to run through all the issues. There are not that many. I'm just going to go at a high level. If you find any of them, think any of them that are interesting to you, let me know and I can talk a little bit more about it or read questions or whatever. Yeah, so there's with the addition of Cluster API v1, there's this new every provider in Cluster API. So there's Cluster API, there's the infrastructure provider, and there's the Bootstrap provider. They all have their own set of CRDs that need to be built and merged and applied to the management cluster. There is not a high-level written introduction to this project that I would say falls under update documentation for v1 alpha 2, which is also something that I would love help with. But we'll get there. I promise we'll get there. So yeah, so it's starting to use Kustomize in order to, because KubeBuilder basically requires that you use Kustomize. All the CRDs it generates have customized files. So if we look at the config, we go into default, say this customization, and then a bunch of patches for all of the different YAML that we'll need. So I've introduced the library Kustomize to this project, and it looks like CapV has done something similar. So there's just an investigation ticket there. I don't actually know what this issue is here in document what registry means. Yeah, so what does the registry mean for uploading images? Yep, we have to update documentation for v1 alpha 2 as requested in chat just now. There's the general support one that is just kind of a tracking issue so we can see how far along we are. Yep, as I said, there's a PR open for updating CAPT control to work with v1 alpha 2 infrastructure. Yes, this is kind of interesting one. So this project, I forgot to mention this. This project uses GitHub Actions for releases. It uses Go Releaser, and it's kind of cool. If you haven't seen GitHub Actions yet, it just makes things a lot easier. So this is the main workflow. This is the release workflow. So every push, this whole thing runs, and if it is a tag, if the push ref is a tag, then it will continue on and run Go Releaser. If it's not, then it just stops at the is tag action, and we move on. So you can see in the GitHub Actions page, there are a lot of just nothing has happened, except here's one where there was a release that went out. So you can see it succeeded all the way through. And that actually is really cool because that builds a nice set of, yeah, so this isn't exactly what it looks like. I edited this a lot, but it does build all of these things for you and upload the assets automatically and give you checksums and all that. I modified the release notes because it was just a list of commits, which is not particularly interesting to anyone. Let's see, how does this compare to Kind? Yeah, so this ends up using the Kind library under the hood. It uses almost a Kind cluster as the management cluster to run all of the different managers for all of the different providers that Cluster API requires. So in short, it is using a little bit of Kind. It is mostly taking advantage of the nodes that Kind provides as a release. So there was a lot of really great work done building Docker images that emulate Kubernetes nodes running containerd. So it gets kind of intense when you're running a Kind node that's running containerd which is also talking to the mounted Docker socket, which is creating new containers. But if you stare at it long enough, it starts to make sense. Okay, I can go skip over this one here. Oh yeah, so automate GitHub Actions. Sorry about that. Yeah, so GitHub automate the GitHub Actions to push images to GCR. I think really what this ticket might be would be integrate with the image promoter process from Kate's Infra. That group has done a lot of really great work to get images into GCR through Prow, and then it will promote those to production images, and it'd be really nice to get those in place, because right now I'm using just a VMware provided Google project for images, which is super not ideal. Yep, there's a bug here. Final control plane can never be deleted. That's true.
Sorry, may I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
In V1 Alpha 2,
yep.
we have to, for getting a cluster working, we have to collect images and CRD from different pieces and put them together. So we have to collect the cluster API,
yep.
The Bootstrap, and the infrastructure, which is this project.
Yep, that's correct.
And you can collect from something published, from your local builds, and whatever. And this is really confusing, at least at the beginning. Is there some document or some smart way to get a cluster with all the pieces up and running quickly?
Yeah, totally. So that's what this pull request is open right here. It's just got a hold on it. Needs that hold removed, and it'll merge. But pretty much what this does is that it updates capd control to go out and fetch all of those different pieces from GitHub, as well as build the local infrastructure provider. So it uses whatever is local to cluster API provider Docker. It assumes you're going to be developing on that, and it's going to go out to GitHub and fetch the different CRDs, actually run customize on them, and then merge them all into your kind cluster, which is your management cluster. And this pull request also adds a bunch of different flags, so you can pick which version of things you want, and allow you to pick exactly what Git ref you need. There's still some work to do to be able to work off of a fork, but I think for now it is good enough to get a management cluster working with all the pieces, so you don't actually have to think about it. You can just say capd control setup, and then you have a management cluster with a Bootstrap provider, the cluster API provider, and then the infrastructure provider itself.
Okay.
It would be good to document this as well, though, just to sort of have a high level document of what cluster API is looking for in a succinct way. And then there's a few more bugs. Yeah, so Linux versus Mac OS. For those of you familiar with Docker on Mac, you might be familiar with this one. Docker on Mac does not have access to, so your laptop is not your host. Your laptop is running a VM, which would be the Docker host. But your laptop then does not have access to the container IPs, which is how you really are going to be accessing the API server. So there's an issue where when you create a cluster with cluster API, it saves a kubeconfig to the secrets in your management cluster. But then if you download the secret from your management cluster, it's going to use the Docker IP address, which in Linux is fine because it's running directly on the host, but in Mac OS, it is not fine because it's running in a VM and does not have access to the pod IP space. So I'm trying to figure out a way to make this nice.
I have commented on this issue and proposed to implement a command couple the ctl config that gets you the config, hiding all these magic of localhost versus IP address.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I do kind of like having that. It's still a matter of like, you have to know which one to get, because when you create the cluster, it could certainly write two secrets. Maybe it could write like a public secret and a private secret or something like that. They're not like public, but like one meant like a secret meant for consumption. But
If
yeah,
you're just like running kubectl in a container, everything is that works.
that's true. Yeah, you could run kubectl through a container.
Yeah, just any container is going to be in the VM's hosts or in the VM's network namespaces. So
yeah, that's not a bad idea either.
and they're Linux binaries. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, so there there are ways around it. What the user experience is going to be like. It would be nice if we could make it, friendly, as nice as it is on Linux. But that's to be figured out by whoever wants to take that ticket. Let's see. Yes, there's a bug. I don't know. This bug needs to be just triage, basically, or not triaged, reproduced. I don't think it exists anymore. Yeah, and then there's some refactor work. So if we look again at the code, yeah, so if we look again at the code, there's this kind directory, and it's got several different things in here. So in the actions, there's two files here, kind.go and clusteractions.go. And this is sort of broken up into two different ways, two different interaction methods. So everything in the kind file is interacting with the management cluster. It's either responsible for, it's talking to the management cluster, so it's telling the management cluster to do something, versus cluster actions are actually talking to the remote cluster itself. And I think there's a certain abstraction here that we could find, that we could split this up and make it, testable and nice, because right now we don't have any tests, because we do things like this. We're just running kubeadm on some node, and that's not super easy to test because we can't inject like node.command as a dependency. So some cleanup work here to do. And I think that would be everything that I wanted to talk about. I don't want to take up too much time. But if there are like questions about this project, we have a Slack channel, Cluster API Docker. I would love to see more people hanging out in there, do code reviews. And we're always looking for contributors. I think one big takeaway from this meeting, at least for me, is having Cluster API v1 Alpha 2 documented on a higher level, just sort of like an introductory Cluster API. I don't know if that exists yet, and I think that would probably be really helpful for people. Okay, are there any questions? Was this helpful?
What so I'm unfamiliar with the difference between the infrastructure and the Bootstrap providers. Do you need
Sure.
both of those, or are they two different scopes?
No, you do need both of those. You'll need an infrastructure provider to provide like the infrastructure, the machines and the load balancers and all those sort of networky things. Mm-hmm. And then you'll need the Bootstrap provider to generate. Right now, the Bootstrap provider has limited scope. Right now, it's generating cloud init files, mm-hmm. so that you can pass that into, say, like user data, and then boot your machine with that user data that's generated through the Bootstrap provider.
So I'm confused that the actions directory that we were just looking at had kubeadm in it, and that was part of the infrastructure provider?
Yeah, so actually running kubeadm init, that should probably be in the cloud. This is, okay, so none of this is really, this cluster actions part has not yet been updated for v1 Alpha 2. Okay. I'm not entirely sure about the interaction between the current Bootstrap provider and Docker, because I don't think these nodes that Kind builds uses cloud init. So the scope of the current kubeadm Bootstrap provider only outputs cloud init. And I don't think that this is actually going to use that at all.
Yeah, Chuck, I was talking with Amy the other day, and I said to her, I'm not really sure how you're going to be able to finagle getting CapD to use cloud init data that the Bootstrap provider generates.
Yeah.
I know that at least with Kind, from what I recall, like the container starts up and maybe does a little bit of work, but at some point it waits for a signal before proceeding.
Yep.
And so like, were we to give you a bash script, for example, as the user data, I'm not sure off the top of my head if you'd be able to take one of your containers that the Kind library is generating and swap in this shell script instead of having to do what it's doing right now. So I think there's more investigation that has to happen there.
Yeah, I think we could. I think it would be fine because right now I'm running kube-idiom join explicitly, and so I could imagine that we take the Bootstrap data, if it were a bash script, just stick it into the container, and then run that bash script in the container.
Yeah, that would be what I would think would be an initial approach.
Yep.
And if we can make that work, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
So
do you think that? Oh, go ahead, Jason.
There's probably going to be some other complications, especially if we start talking about injecting additional files for being able to configure like the auth for the cluster and things like that. So it probably, if possible, the best approach would probably be to know that the Bootstrap tool is outputting certain Cloud Init configuration options like write file or run command and things like that. And you should be able to just extract that data and just basically fake Cloud Init, interactively for the limited subset that we need.
Yep. And I think it's also important to remember that this is just a development tool. And so we can actually, it's okay to push those edge case, any of those edge case things that may come up off the scope of this project. But I think that, there could be some fun way to go from Cloud Init to bash script or something like that.
Yeah, you're gonna want to use a Cloud Init executor and just give it the Cloud Init config. But you don't have to like read it in over the network or anything like that. You can just pipe it right in as an exec. Yeah, that was the part that was kind of unclear to me. So thanks for addressing that. Is the plan to use Kind to actually create the nodes with the Docker socket, or are we just going to create containers?
We just create this. So this sets up a Kind cluster for the management cluster.
Yeah.
Beyond that, it runs containers.
So we're not going to use Kind for the actual infrastructure, and the Kinds part is actually just a helper, right? Like you could use CapD with any management cluster.
That's right.
Because it's just going to use your config.
Yes, that's right.
So like I could like spin up K3s or whatever Minikube, and it would still work.
Maybe depending on how the Docker
socket's met. Yeah.
But if I got it right, you are using the kind base image with container D.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Well, yeah, but that's just for the management cluster. So it's unrelated to where the containers are getting created because the host Docker socket is being passed into the Kind machines.
No, that's for all the machines. So when you use the Docker base image for creating the management cluster.
Yes.
And then you use the Kind base image for creating a machine for the workload cluster.
From my understanding, that's not what Chuck is saying.
Oh, I might be misunderstanding the question.
Are you going to be using Kind to create the infrastructure nodes for the child cluster?
No.
Yeah. You're just getting a Docker socket from the host so that you're using Kind for the management cluster, and then you're going to just use raw Docker
So I think you two are talking past each other a little bit. I think Fabrizio is talking about using the kind generated images for the individual instances. And you're talking specifically about using kind the tool. So
Yeah, so originally this project was called Cluster API Provider Kind, but then we ended up not really using kind, and that ended up being confusing because kind is really two things. Kind is two very different things. It's the command line tool, and it's also the Go library. The Go library is extremely limited, which gives you pretty much the ability to create a node, create a kind node, and that's it. Like a kind Kubernetes node using the kindest/node image. So that's what we're using. So we are using the kind library. We're not using the kind command line tool. So we're not creating full clusters using like a kind create cluster. We're not doing that because that's not flexible enough.
Yes, but you're creating the management cluster that way.
Which way?
Using the kindest image with the Go libraries.
Yes.
Yeah, you're from capd, you're creating effectively a kind cluster using the Go interfaces.
Yeah.
But that's for the management cluster. And then once you have the management cluster, you're mounting the Docker socket from the host machine into the management cluster so that the capd operator can then create containers not using any kind related things on the host, right? But am I understanding?
That's
the plan.
It's
because
still
it's not
using,
implemented.
Yeah. It's still using like the kind library to run. So it is kind of using kind libraries to run these commands as like the operator is using these.
Okay.
But it is not using the kind command line tool in any way.
Yeah. So what Fabrizio is saying is correct in that you intend to use kind machinery to create containers on the host.
Right.
For the child clusters from Cluster API.
Not full kind machinery, just the kindest node.
Okay.
Yeah.
So using a kind image with raw Docker.
And to answer to Andy, the latest kindest node, which use containerd, doesn't have the wait cycle at the beginning because containerd is different than Docker. So probably it will be easier to get Cloud Init in.
Pablo, you had your hand raised. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think that it was already so. I mean, the idea is to keep using Kinder, right? The library for creating the nodes of the...
So Kinder, we are not using the Kinder library, but I would like to figure out a way to integrate with the Kinder library at some point in the future.
Well, I think the Kinder, because basically what we're using is similar to what Kinder is doing.
Yep.
And at some point, I was talking to Fabrizio about using Kinder, and since I can recall currently, there are a few things that were needed to probably change, but the major part are there. I said because that way we can share the work of maintaining that library between two projects. And I think that we have some common requirements that are not so common to Kind, which is like the ability to fine-tune the bootstrap of the nodes. It's like, I understand it was the main reason for Kinder to exist, right?
Yeah, I think Kinder, I mean, I can't speak, Fabrizio can probably speak more about this, but Kinder seemed more like a deconstructed kind that gave you fine-grained control over a cluster, a local cluster.
Yes, it gives you control. Kind gives you a working Kubernetes cluster. So while Kinder gives you control from machine to Kubernetes.
Yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
I had a question on kind of a slightly different topic. So if you guys want to, if there's anything else, I can go after. Okay. I wanted to know what are we thinking about for multiple control plane nodes. Is there going to be a load balancer?
Yep.
Kind of
That's one of the requirements for this, is that every cluster, regardless of how many control planes you have, will have a load balancer to go with it. Because we cannot anticipate what kind of cluster you're going to make, because all we know is you want to make a control plane, you want to add a control plane, we don't know that up front. So if you create a control plane, the first control plane gets a load balancer, and every control plane thereafter modifies the load balancer to add itself to the pool.
Is there a canonical load balancer we expect to use?
I just forked whatever kind was using at the time. I think it was Nginx, but I think they've gone back to whatever the other one is.
They are using HA proxy now.
HA proxy, yeah. So that's another piece of like technical debt. Since I started this on Kind version 0.3, they were using Nginx, and now they've gone back to HA proxy. I would like to fork in that stuff as well.
So I'm a little, I'm not following how far the technical implementation of this is, Chuck.
So it works. Yeah, totally. It works, and it's released for V1 Alpha 1, and it's like supports HA clusters, and it worked really well for Alpha 1. So now the problem is V1 Alpha 2 changed so much, and we're still in development process of V1 Alpha 2, that this is not like fully fleshed out now.
Okay, wait, yeah. So if I look at the branch list here, release 0.1 is working?
Yes.
So
if you want to play with the cluster API V1 Alpha 1, use the release 0.1 branch. If you want to help get V1 Alpha 2 to working state, work off of the master branch.
Okay, cool. That makes sense.
Cool.
Sweet.
Okay. Are there any other questions, or should we wrap it up here? Sweet. Okay, then I will stop recording.